the Revolutionary War, and ever since, for the rest of his life, hated the British deeply. But if you remember, he basically, as a general, right, won the Great Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. And then, having an army and the war being over, he decided to invade Florida and take it away from the Spanish and add it to the United States without any orders from Washington. Andrew Jackson also famously sparked a great controversy with the Supreme Court by refusing to obey an order from the Supreme Court. And he's famously recorded saying, well, Chief Justice John Marshall has reached his decision, well, let him enforce it himself. So those are the top 10 presidents in American history. Who do you think scholars rank as the worst president in American history? And I just want to say no naming anyone who's been president in the last 25 years, because they did not make the list. Buchanan, very good. You have a ringer up here. Now, when I speak at college campuses, I say Buchanan. I actually get a look of recognition because they think actually Pat Buchanan might be president when they're kids. And I had no doubt that if Buchanan had been president, he would be the worst president in our history. But in fact, it's James Buchanan, who was the president right before Lincoln. And in fact, just to turn to the thesis of the book, Buchanan, the difference between Buchanan and Lincoln really expresses the thesis of my book, which is that the presidency is designed for crisis. The reason it exists at all in our constitutional system is to be able to respond to unforeseen crises, to emergencies, and really war. War is what they had in mind, is why you need the presidency. And so those presidents, all those presidents we listed, are presidents who, when they were confronted by these kinds of challenges and crises or war, ultimately war, reacted strongly, immediately, with their own view of their constitutional powers, and didn't look to the other branches to tell them what to do, branches of government. The worst presidents, actually, Buchanan, some of you mentioned Pierce, I'm going to explain James Madison, who actually wrote the first draft of the Constitution, actually was not a good president. Andrew Jackson. These are all people who either tried to exercise broad presidential power when times were peaceful and times they called for it, or when they were confronted by emergency and crisis, actually responded by looking to Congress or to the Supreme Court for leadership rather than exercising themselves. So James Buchanan, the worst president in our history, right, is president when Lincoln's elected and the South begins to secede. Buchanan's response was, and this is fairly typical for any of you who have watched or worked in legislatures, Buchanan's response was to ask Congress what to do. He actually issued a legal opinion saying that he thought secession was unconstitutional, just as Lincoln would later say. But he said the president has no constitutional authority to do anything about it. There's no way the president can actually stop the southern states from leaving. And so what did he do? He formed a special committee, asked Congress to form a special committee to study the problem, which they did. And if it hadn't been for Lincoln becoming president, I'm sure that committee would still be meeting today. Lincoln comes into office, right? He's president when Fort Sumter is fired on. He decides on his own authority as commander-in-chief and chief executive to protect the country. And he raises an army and navy, he takes money out of the treasury, he imposes a blockade on the South, he calls up volunteers, he sends them into offensive operations in the South, all before Congress even gets together to decide what to do. Congress eventually ratifies his decisions, but not for several months. Lincoln, in fact, becomes the first president to directly refuse to obey an order from a Chief Justice of the United States. The Chief Justice of the United States was a fellow named Roger Taney, who was from Baltimore. There was a rebellion in Baltimore at the very start of the Civil War. The general in charge of Baltimore, or in Baltimore, sits on the crucial line of communication between the North and Washington, D.C. The general in charge captures Confederate rebels and puts them in the brig. The Chief Justice of the United States issues a writ of habeas corpus that says you have to release all of them. Right? We're not at war with them. They're citizens. They should be given a criminal trial. Forgive me if this echoes from what's going on today. And so he says, unless you're going to prosecute these guys, you have to release him. This is a case called Merriman, ex parte Merriman. He says, you must release him. And he issues an order to the general in charge of Baltimore who refuses to do it. So he sends the order to President Lincoln. And Lincoln refused. He's actually the only president, I believe, who's ever refused to obey a direct order of the Supreme Court. Lincoln's greatest act as president is also his greatest act of presidential power, was the Emancipation Proclamation. If you have friends who always say, oh, the president has no power, no president's ever exercised any power, they always wait for Congress to give them permission first, ask them about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is solely an order, a military order by the president, as commander-in-chief, as a military measure to free the slaves in the South, which is the only reason it applied. If you read it, it only applies to the South. It does not apply to the loyal areas of the North. There were still some slaves in places like Delaware and Maryland, because this was an exercise of his commander-in-chief power. Right? Congress at the time had its own solution to freeing the slaves. Again, you can guess what they did if you have ever worked for the legislature as I have. They wrote a special bill which required the government to prove that any slave that was in Union lines and made it to the North, that their owner was actually in the South, and that you'd had an individual hearing in federal court to prove that before they could be freed. So we have all these problems today about court congestion, but if that bill had actually been the way we tried to free the slaves, we'd still be hearing those court cases today. Right? Lincoln said, that's not the policy we're going to pursue, and I'm going to free the slaves instead as a war measure. But he, understanding that it's only under his power as commander-in-chief, it only lasted as long as the war. That's why he wanted so badly to make sure the 13th Amendment, ending slavery in the United States, was enacted and ratified before the war actually ended. So let me discuss two of the other great presidents, just to give you more examples of this thesis. The first one is George Washington. George Washington was the first president, the most important president in terms of setting the structure of the office. Just to give you one example, a president could have read the Constitution and thought, you know, maybe I'm like a prime minister and I kind of work for Congress. Or you could read the Constitution that way. Some presidents have acted that way. Some presidents have taken their lead from Congress and seen their jobs more as a manager of a coalition. Washington would have none of that. Washington thought himself as an independent, the presidency is an independent branch of government. This was really revealed the first time he had to deal with the Senate. One of the first things he did as president was to negotiate, to come up with negotiating terms with the Indian tribes to reach a peace settlement on the western frontier. So he read the Constitution, and it says, as you know, this says the president makes treaties by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. So Washington said, well, maybe I better go over and actually talk to the Senate. So Washington walked across the street, entered the Senate chamber, and he had a list of 10 questions in his pocket. And you can imagine, if you've ever watched C-SPAN, how many questions Washington got through. One. He asked one question. The senators started all talking, some of them asking Washington more questions, many of them arguing with each other. After it was all over, actually it wasn't all over, in the middle of it, Washington, who was a physically large man, one of the biggest physically large people of his generation, jumped up and just stormed out of the Senate and allegedly said, I'll be damned if I ever step foot in there again. And actually, no president ever has since. No president has ever gone to seek the advice and consent of the Senate in person before negotiating a treaty or appointing a Supreme Court justice or appointing cabinet officers. You may take their advice informally, but Washington, that incident was the first, last, and only time a president went in person to take the advice of the Senate, leading to a great increase in the balance of power towards the president's side in matters like treaties and appointments. Washington's greatest act as president was to make sure that the United States stayed out of what would become the Napoleonic Wars, staying out of the wars between France and Great Britain. Those were the superpowers of the day. They were locked in a battle of life and death, and they were trying to draw the United States into it. Washington saw, I think rightly so, that America's best interest was to stay out and to make a lot of money selling things to both sides, which we used to like to do during wartime. So Washington, as president, took the advice of his cabinet, decided that he wasn't going to ask Congress for its opinion, and issued a proclamation that the United States would be neutral in the conflict, which became called the Neutrality Proclamation. If you read the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about the president being allowed to set foreign policy, right, to decide whether the country would be peaceful or hostile to another country. You could have thought Congress had the equal right to do it, but Washington decided that has to be a presidential power, and ever since, it has been a presidential power, for good or ill. But it was Washington who first set that precedent and interpreted the Constitution to give that authority. So let me turn to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's become a much more controversial figure these days, now that we are in the second worst economic depression in this century. And people question whether the New Deal actually succeeded in bringing us out of the Great Depression or not. I think many historians actually say FDR had only I like to make fun of Berkeley a lot. To teach at Berkeley, you have to have a sense of humor because of all the great material you're constantly surrounded by. But I do encourage you all to come by and visit Berkeley. I haven't been in a while, and walk down Telegraph Avenue for two reasons. One, it's sort of like going to the Natural History Museum and seeing those panoramas. This man discovered fire in the 1960s. You can kind of go and see that's what the 1960s were like. But the other thing about Berkeley is the unfortunate side is you can really see what happens when the liberals actually get to run stuff. Take a look around and see what happens. So the city's not in the best of shape these days.
John, you're great.
Thank you. About the protesters, if there anyone else, they should do it now. So everyone's waiting to pay attention. I also wonder, and I'll get to this at the end of my talk, is why they don't protest President Obama. Because he promised to do something completely different, and as we saw yesterday, he's sort of coming around slowly to the Bush administration's hated counterterrorism policies. It's sort of hard to see what's left, actually, that he isn't doing that we did in the Bush administration. Talk a little bit about that at the end. Another person is FDR. And I was just going to say, so many historians wonder whether if he'd only been president for 2 terms, whether he even would have thought to have been a successful president. Because the Supreme Court tried to stop a lot of the New Deal. Roosevelt engaged, I think, in one of the most blatant acts of pressuring the Supreme Court by threatening to pack it. Right? If you remember, he said, there were 5 justices who were holding many elements of the New Deal unconstitutional. There were 4 who were not. Roosevelt, after winning the 1936 election, seeing that the Supreme Court was impeding the New Deal, under what I feel today is actually the proper interpretation of the Constitution, Roosevelt basically said, he never did things like this directly. He was almost too clever by half. He said, there are all these old people on the Supreme Court. It's really, really hard for them to do their job. So any justice who's over 70,